I'm going to talk a little bit about a culture of generosity within the context of this series of talks on internationality as a kind of context to create Sangha, really. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't been here for the last few weeks. I've been unable to come to these evenings, but I have listened to the benefit of the online recording. I have listened to the talks and I've really enjoyed them. I think they've been very, very good. So I've appreciated them. I'm very glad to be continuing on with this series. And I'm going to just pick up on a few of these, and this is not going to be a full recap of all those talks, but I'm just going to pick up on some of the themes that have been touched on over the weeks, in a way, as a way of leading into what I want to say about a culture of generosity. Actually, just do let me know that if you can't hear me, maybe just cup your ear, because my voice can trail off a little bit. The tendency. So just let me know by just cupping your ear if you can't hear me at any point. The first week, Sadhanita introduced the topic, and she introduced it by reading a quote from a talk from Sangharakshita, Bhante Sangharakshita, the founder of Triratna. And I'm going to repeat it again because I thought it was really good, and I thought it was really good in conjuring up what this series was about. So in a talk in Mumbai many years ago, Sangharakshita said, I believe that humanity is basically one. I believe that it is possible for any human being to communicate with any other human being, to be friends with any other human being. That is what I truly and deeply believe. This belief is part of my own experience. It is part of my own life. It is part of me. And I cannot live without this belief. And I would rather die than give it up. So in a way, I found that I've heard that quite a few times. It's quite well known amongst those of us who have been Triratna. But I always find it moving to hear that. It's such a strong, in a way, a passionate statement of belief, of experience. It's even a bit like a creed. We don't have a creed we don't tend to have a creed in Triratna, but in a way, this quote is Sangharakshita sort of talking about what he really deeply believes in. And in a way, he rarely comes across quite so passionately as he does here. But I found it very moving. And as I say, I think it sort of sets a vision for what this series was about. And I think it's significant that that talk was given in India, yeah? And Sangharakshita lived in India for over 20 years. And in a way, he lived out this vision that's encapsulated in this statement. He became very good friends with people from very different backgrounds, from very different nationalities, from an Indian background, Nepali background. He had some very good Tibetan friends like his teacher, Dada Rinpoche. They didn't really share the same language. But they became really good friends nevertheless. So that's quite striking. So Sangharakshita lived out this vision of friendship and the possibility and the benefit of connecting with people irrespective of their nationality and cultural background. And when he returned to the UK and set up this Triratna Buddhist order and the wider community, that's very much the ethos that he projected, really. The ethos of the Triratna order is we welcome people from all backgrounds, all different cultural backgrounds. So I think it's very good that Sadhanita started this series with such an emphatic statement of a sort of vision, which, although the words are sort of their actions and about his personal vision, I think that carries through in a way you could say it's about the vision of the Triratna Buddhist order as well. So on the second week, Arthur City was interviewing Isabel and Dianita and actually Adi, wasn't it? Yeah. And again, I found that really engaging and really interesting to hear of the experience of growing friendships within the Sangha from three people who weren't born here in the UK. They came from very different backgrounds. But despite those differences of language, culture, nationality, they formed very strong friendships. It was delightful to hear about those friendships. And I was thinking, not only did those differences of language and culture, not only did they not get in the way, but actually what came across to me from those interviews were that actually those differences really helped them. It really helped them to understand their own conditioning, what they brought, the assumptions and norms they brought to interacting with each other. And through understanding themselves more clearly, in a way, the Dharma became clearer and came through more strongly because of the engagement with each other and anyway, seeing through that conditioning. Okay, so week 3, this is a fast track recap. So again, Arthur Siddhi was talking last week about identity. I found this very interesting. He was talking about personal and cultural identity. We have a cultural identity. And he was asking this question, is cultural identity something that we need to drop as Buddhists, even discard, if that was possible? Or is it something fixed and something permanent within us, as it were? Something maybe that we even need to lean into even more. So I found that really interesting, that exploration. And again, what I picked up from his talk, that in a way, sorry, I've lost my place here. That our identity, our social, our cultural identity is not something that we can sort of say has an absolute validity. It's not something that's fixed. If we relate to, in that way, if we relate that our identity is fixed in that way, well, that can cause us trouble, that can cause us suffering, and it can cause both suffering for ourselves and others. Taken to extreme, an over-identification with our own particular social or cultural identity, that can lead to division and even violence. We've seen not very recently the kind of violence that can, the violence in the UK that can emerge from an identifying of a particular cultural identity and pushing away other identities. Yeah. There is a sutta, what I'm not going to talk about here, called the Honeyball Sutta. If you're interested in exploring how the sort of mental proliferation of ideas that can divide people unfolds, have a look at the Honeyball Sutta in the Pali Canon. It sort of very clearly describes how the process in which division can take place. So what I felt Arthur City was sort of encouraging us to do is to relate to us. We need to develop a positive relationship to our cultural identity. We need to value our cultural heritage and what is positive in our cultural heritage, and explore why do we need to do that. Well, we need to do that in a sense to come into positive relationship with ourselves, to develop in a way metta for ourselves, and also in a way to hold cultural identity more lightly. We need to have a positive relationship to it, to value it. I was reminded here in my youth when I was at university, and I was a bit of politically, I was quite left wing. And what I realized is, looking back, is I sort of rejected my middle class background. I didn't want to be middle class. I wanted to be working class, but I wasn't working class. You don't get many working class people in Maidenhead, where I came from. And I realized I was pushing that way, but actually over time, I've sort of come to a sense, well, I'm a middle class person. That's how I've been brought up. That's the background. And actually, there are quite a lot of positive things about being middle class. There's some not so positive things. But in a way, I realized I had to come into more positive relationship with that conditioning, that background, and sort of positively relate to it, as it were. So this is what, in a way, this is my understanding. I'll still correct me if I'm wrong. What we're trying to do in practice is to have a positive relationship to our conditioning, really take the positive in our social and cultural identity, but not let it define us too strongly, but hold it in a way provisionally. Yeah, in a way, we need to relate to our identity in that way, in the relative nature of our identity. And again, I wanted to bring up some own personal experience. Just before I went to university, I traveled quite a lot in India. In fact, I was in India traveling around for 6 months. And I was only 18 then. It was a bit of a blast, as you can imagine. And India was very different then. It wasn't as modern as it is now. And what impacted me is the assumptions that I made, the norms about social behavior, how I thought things were in the world, were challenged. And I realized that many of them were just my conditioning. Yeah. They didn't have an absolute value. They were they were my own conditioning. And that I think, looking back, really positively unsettled me. I think it can be useful to be positively unsettled. And looking back, writing this talk, I think that being positively unsettled, in a way, having my own conditioning or the reality of my own condition questioned, I think was one of the things that opened me up to the Dharma, really, opened me up to what the Dharma was saying. Okay, maybe that might be a little bit longer than I expected as a way of recap. But how does all this relate to my main topic, which is culture of generosity in terms of encouraging, supporting the Sangha? Well, firstly, I want to talk about generosity, or in the traditions, I'll interchange generosity and dana, which is the Buddhist word for generosity. I want to talk about generosity as an antidote to what can happen when we meet people of different cultures, of different groups, different nationalities, language, and background. There's something that can happen when we meet that difference, is we're challenged. Our identity is challenged in some way, particularly, if we're not so confident in ourselves. And in a way, one thing is, in a way, that the response of withdrawal or contracting or pushing away others, in a way, though others that present values or cultures outside our own, in a way, the first thing to say is, well, maybe that's quite natural. It's quite a human response. But in a way, what I want to argue here is, in a way, generosity and the developing the quality of generosity, a spirit of generosity in different ways, is a way of overcoming those the more even instinctive withdrawal from difference when our identity feels threatened. I think it's a really good response to that kind of contractive reactive response. I mean, after all, we are beings that are trying to fix ourselves. We're trying to justify ourselves to ourselves all the time. A term I like is selfing, and that seems to describe a sort of the desire to fix ourselves, to know who we are, to pin ourselves down, even though that project is really impossible. And one of the things that can happen, the way we do that, the way we try and pin ourselves, is not just an internal thing. I would say it's also an external thing. We project, as it were, who we are outwards. And if within a particular culture, there are norms which and ways of behaving which tend to reinforce that selfing, that trying to pin ourselves down, trying to often the culture reinforces our own individual pinning ourselves down, as it were, that attempt to pin ourselves down. Generosity is a way of overcoming that tendency to withdraw, as it were. And I think what I want to argue here is that the practice of dana, or generosity, works against this tendency. It creates a link, a connection with others, even a bond with others, that opens up to beneficial mutual influence. So I'm going to say a little bit about dana now within the Buddhist tradition. So dana is very important, and it appears as a practice, as an encouragement within many of the Buddhist texts and traditions. There are lots of lists. One of the famous ones is the 6 perfections of a bodhisattva, the bodhisattva being the ideal Buddhist practitioner. So dana is the first of the paramitas. I'll come back to that later, the perfections. But maybe the most relevant Buddhist list in relation to dana is what we call the 4 Sangha. So some of you may have heard of that. So I'll just say a bit about these 4 Sangha. So sometimes Sangha is very formally translated as the means of unification. That's strange title, strange translation. But less formally, the 4 Sangha are what draws a Sangha together, what draws a spiritual community together, and what helps that community to deepen, to go deeper in its friendships. The other 3, just for your reference, the other 3 Sangha are kindly or loving speech, beneficial action, responding and helping others, and exemplification, or drawing out the best in others. So I'm not going to go off on those. Our project today is to talk about dana. So the question here is, how does dana, generosity, how does it work against this tendency to cut off from others when our identity, when we're threatened in some way? Well, I was thinking at the most basic level, dana or generosity involves a going out of ourselves. It breaks us out of self-reference. And even the most unconsidered gift to others, an unconsidered attitude of generosity, has some awareness of another person, some awareness of that they are a separate human being. But if we make a habit of giving, my experience is that it opens one up to another person. If you share a generous attitude or even a material gift, it tends to relax oneself and the other person. It opens up the space between oneself and another. It eases the communication I've found. And it creates that kind of openness. Giving affirms the being of another. It affirms the being that they have value to you. So it illustrates that. It sort of embodies that message. Even without regard to the other person, giving enriches oneself. If one takes the initiative to think about a gift or how to be generous with another, you're taking the initiative. And my experience is that gives one confidence. If that gives one confidence, then one's less likely to take offense or less likely to be defensive with others, in the dialogue with others. So giving builds a connection, builds a bond with another. Yeah. And then as you go deeper with this practice of generosity, the practice of giving requires one to develop an awareness of others. Yeah. You need to develop an awareness of what they need. It requires being imaginative, imaginatively connecting with others. Of course, there are many things that others need. And part of the practice of Dharma is learning to be sensitive and find out the most appropriate thing that people need. So one needs to develop a sensitivity towards others in this practice of Dharma. And if a person is from a different cultural background or than oneself, one needs to make a bit of an extra effort to understand what they'd like. You know, what would they find beneficial, and also maybe being aware of what they might find not very helpful. Yeah. So of course, with generosity, with giving, we're not just talking about material gifts. Sometimes what is needed, thinking with others, is just really to listen. It's a real gift, isn't it? To really listen, to really hear, and to show the other person that you've heard what they've said. That's often a rare gift. So in the Buddhist tradition, a whole range of kind of gifts are elucidated, as it were, or explored, from the basics of food and drink and shelter, to protection, to the giving of confidence. That's a really important gift one can give to others. One can give money when needed. One can even give life and limb in extremity. But the tradition says the greatest gift that one can give is the Dharma, because it addresses the basic, the core element of our human condition. Of course, the gift of the Dharma, as it were, cuts through different cultural differences, as it were, and it enables a deep connection, as I think really came out in the interviews a couple of weeks ago. I think that was what communicated itself. The Dharma becomes clearer through seeing through a different cultural conditioning. So while there are many, I could go on and explore this a bit more, while there are many individual benefits for practicing a generosity, when the practice is taken on by a community, that it almost like goes on to a different level, and something quite magic can happen, really. Often, I think, when you're in a community, a body of people who is collectively practicing generosity, there's what emerges a really strong sense of abundance, in lots of different levels. And going further, I think when generosity is embodied within the community, it's practiced. It moves from becoming a practice to just natural behavior, as it were. Then something else can happen, something even deeper can happen. The boundaries between each other begin to dissolve. And differences in personality, character, nationality, background well, those differences don't become a barrier, and in a way they're an area of like very interesting and fruitful, even fascinating exploration, and rejoicing and celebrating in that difference, positive elements of different cultures. So I just mentioned here, many of you will know for many years I worked with in a team-based livelihood with quite a number of people. So in a way, we were a community. We were quite a close-knit community. But we were a community of people from very many different backgrounds. At one time, I think there were over 20 different nationalities worked together. And often there were people who came straight from another culture, straight into working with us. But that was a very magic time. It was a very magic time working together and being a community. And there was a lot of generosity in that community. Again, referencing Sangha, he says that, and this is paraphrasing a bit, that a true Sangha or spiritual community is marked by the constant exchange of gifts. So in a way, if we see Dharma happening with a community, in a way you could say that's one sign or one indication of an effective spiritual community, that there is this generous spirit and the exchange of gifts. Yeah, so how am I going? Oh, okay. A little bit more. So I've talked in a way generally, a little bit more generally about Dharma and the culture of Dharma and the principles involved. I want us to talk about three related topics, which you could say are within the family of the culture of generosity. They're sort of virtues that grow out of generosity. And there are three that I think are particularly important. Yeah. So the first of these is hospitality. Yeah, is being hospitable. This is a virtue I've noticed that is stronger in some cultures than other cultures. Last week, Arthur Siddy was talking a bit about this. It's interesting that I wrote this down before he gave that talk, but Arthur Siddy was talking about, really lovely, intimate dialogue that he had with Akshai Deep about the different strengths, different virtues and qualities in different cultures. And I know from visiting India that the culture of hospitality is very strong, and it's a lovely quality. So I've been thinking a little bit about this quality of hospitality. It's very strong in ancient Greece. Hospitality, the term in ancient Greek culture was, I think I say is xenia. I think that's how you pronounce it. It was very strong, and it was interesting that in a way, it seemed to bind the culture together very strongly. One of the things that encouraged people to be hospitable in ancient Greece was that the gods sometimes disguised themselves as ordinary people, even poor people. So if you are inhospitable to a stranger, then you might be offending one of the gods. In fact, there's a story about how Zeus and Hermes dressed themselves up as ordinary people, and they went to a village, and most of the village were just sort of turned them away, and they were almost about to leave when an elderly couple said, "Come in," and they were very generous to the disguised Zeus and Hermes. Anyway, they were looked after and supported. The rest of the village was wiped away. Anyway, I'm not suggesting that that is the Buddhist attitude, but it is. I'm just more out of interest. These virtues can be promoted in different ways, but I'd like to be promoting generosity, not out of fear, but out of the benefit for oneself, actually, and for the benefit of others. I was reflecting partly on hospitality recently because a very good friend of mine, Abaya Kirti, died recently, and he was renowned for being very hospitable. It might have been initiated by he came from Jamaica, so that was his background, and so that may have been influenced his hospitality. But yeah, just I really reflected and appreciated. He was one of the most hospitable people I've known. If he turned you down for a bed at night or a meal, then there had to be a really good reason for it, because usually he would stop everything to entertain you and to look after you. I also wanted to tell another little story here, actually. Again, when I went to India, when I was, well, still a teenager, almost 18, 19. So towards the end of my travels in India, I had the misfortune of someone stealing my bag. Yeah. So I had my money, I had my passport. Do you remember traveller's checks? That shows my age, isn't it? This is the early 80s. So all that was gone. I did have a little bit of money stowed away. I was a bit stunned, and then I arrived at my destination on the railway station, and I was a bit stunned. I didn't know what I was going to do. Anyway, I was met by a more elderly Indian man who came up to me, and he was someone who made a little bit of a living by offering people to stay travelers to stay in a room in his house. So anyway, he met me, and I said, well, I'd love to stay in your house, but I don't know if I can pay you. So I've been, unfortunately, I've just had my bag stolen. Anyway, he turned straight to me, said, no problem, no problem. Just come and stay with me. That's fine. If you can't pay me, that's fine. Much more than that, he could see that, I was quite agitated by having that experience. So he looked out for me, this young lad of 18. And I remember him taking me to this beautiful, it was a Hindu shrine actually, but it was very hidden away, but beautiful, quite a magical place. But he took me there and showed me something that was valuable to him. So for me, that kindness of strangers really stuck in my mind. So it's something that it's a quality of hospitality that I've tried to keep in mind. Personally, I love having people. I live in a community and I love having visitors to come and stay. So I always try and say yes if someone asks. This is partly to work against my own tendency, my introvert tendencies to just like not want to have my own space. But usually, and 9 times out of 10, someone comes, I get something out of it. It's really interesting to hear someone from a different background. We've recently had someone from India, a young man from India visiting us a little while back, someone from Australia. So something I try and practice. Yeah. So that's a quality of hospitality. Yeah, so I mentioned 2 others more briefly. One other is sharing. Sharing in a way is a kind of generosity. A couple of weeks ago, I visited a co-op housing project where actually Dianita lives, and Tejasvini and Alice, who are members of the Sangha here. And what I was really taken by was just the care of the collective, the shared situation, and how much they shared with each other. They shared their possessions. It was really moving, actually, to see the degree to which they share their possessions, as well as being eco-friendly and well, I'm sure it helped them financially to be sharing things. There was something about sharing their lives and sharing their possessions in this community of about, I think there were about 40 different household units that moved me. So I won't say any more about sharing, but I think there's something in that that could be explored within the Sangha more. And lastly, I want to mention as a virtue connected with generosity is gratitude. Yeah. So I think gratitude, if there is a culture of generosity, there will also be gratitude. I was thinking gratitude could be defined as an imaginative appreciation of the value and benefit received from others. And we certainly receive a lot of benefit from others. So gratitude takes attention and reflection to foster. But when it's truly felt, when we truly feel gratitude, then the natural response is to be generous and give to others. So yes, I think, so I mentioned there's three things of hospitality, sharing, and gratitude as aspects of creating a culture of generosity. So lastly, I just wanted to tie up by just in a way reminding us that in a way dharma or generosity, the practice of dharma or generosity spans the whole range of the Buddhist path, right from the very beginning, right to the, as it were, you could say, the threshold of enlightenment. Dharma is important all throughout the spiritual life, the spiritual path. I mentioned earlier that dharma is the first of the Bodhisattva's 6 perfections. The fact that it's first illustrates something, I think, that right from the very start of practicing as a Buddhist, practicing a spiritual life, we can practice dharma. I was thinking, even if I'm in a bad mood, even if I've sort of don't want anything to do with the spiritual life, I'm struggling in one way or another, I can still give. And I remind myself that, I try and remind myself to that, to come back to the practice of giving. And if I can manage that, if I can manage to be generous in one way or another, even if it's just a generous spirit, then it takes myself out of myself. And that's a relief, isn't it? I don't know about you, but it's a relief to be taken out of yourself sometimes. So I think it's significant that you can start the Buddhist path, you could say, starts with dharma. One of the Buddhist precepts is refraining from taking the ungiven, from stealing, from taking. And in a way, I think the significance of that is taking from another is a negation, or at the very least, an unawareness of another. It betrays an unawareness, a lack of imagination of what the consequences are for others. But the positive precept is with open-handed generosity. I purify my body. So as we've said, generosity connects with others. Yeah. And we know through practicing the metta and metta bhavana and friendship, it connects us with others. And one of the things, well, when we begin to participate with others and we practice in that way, we can rejoice in other merits. And that is another way, or another gift, another expression of generosity. So finally, I'll just end with the practice of generosity taken to its ultimate, really. And this is when the Bodhisattva, the ideal practitioner, reaches what's called the perfection of generosity. And when the Bodhisattva reaches this, it's said that he or she gives without the idea of a giver. but also without the idea of there being someone to give, or even with a reference to there being a gift. So I think when we've reached that stage, when we really entered that mysterious way, we would have really arrived within a culture of giving.